I am Erin Wright. I'm a product manager over at MasterControl, and we'll be talking about the future of validation, current state, what's really the appropriate interpretation of the software validation, looking at CSA and what's coming down the road from CDRH, as well as how we can get into self-validating software and having a much more forward-thinking approach to how we validate our software. So the first thing we should touch on is current state, right? Computer software validation. This came out of obviously 21 CFR Part 11, which came out in 1997, and it has a very documentation-heavy mindset, right? Is that the whole point of the validation is to create what's colloquially called a thump factor. So the bigger the thump that your validation package makes when you put it on the table in front of your auditors or your inspectors, the more impressive that your validation process is. And I personally say this all the time, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And it really puts that documentation of what you're doing at the forefront. But that doesn't actually mean that documentation is providing more value to your validation process. And so with the CSV mindset, there's a lot of focus on documenting everything, having the paperwork in place, having the documentation to present it, and then testing everything more with an eye towards documenting your testing versus coming up with the different appropriate levels of testing. And there's very little critical thinking that comes with a CSV mindset, is that you're going to test every bell, every whistle. If I click save, it saves. If I hit cancel, it cancels. And back in 2019, 2020, Francisco Vicente from CDRH started sharing out this mindset of CSA, the computer software assurance. So putting the foundation of the way that we're approaching our validation with critical thinking, being able to document this risk-based approach, what are our real scenarios that we want to focus on, and not these very bizarre edge cases that came from the possible configurations of our software, and using that critical thinking to drive the testing process, and then creating a documentation that only really serves your business needs and not just for meeting the regulatory needs. And so it's a very different mindset and a very different approach to how we have currently done CSV and software validation in the regulated world, too many lattes, previously. And so when we get into how it came from, the original industry approach for Part 11 and software validation, when Part 11 came out in '97, there really wasn't much guidance on what validating your software meant. Software was very immature. It wasn't very common. We didn't have all the apps and bells and whistles and this fully digitized experience that we do today working in regulated industry. And so when Part 11 came out in '97, the closest thing that most of industry had to look at when they're coming to validating software was the Part 820, so looking at the medical device validation process. And so essentially, since that was the closest thing that industry had to guidance on how to validate software, that became the de facto process. And what that essentially means is that software like MasterControl, which is a quality management system, was treating the criticality of getting your training records late with the same criticality as the software embedded in a pacemaker. And while I am heavily invested in people getting their training records completed on time, getting their training tasks completed on time, it's not quite the literal heart stopper of your pacemaker software functionality not working the same as well as it should. And so we took this mindset of validating to a software medical device degree across all regulated software. And it doesn't really make sense and isn't the best use of your business time. So like another example that we use is that we have our help file embedded in our software, for example. And we have formal validation tests. Customers have written formal validation tests to validate that the help file pulls up when you have a question to look at things. And we're treating that with the same criticality as making sure that the audit trail is logging appropriately. And it's not the same weighted effort of what is important for your business needs for your real intended usage of the software. And so this has become the industry standard of this is how you validate software. This is what companies expect for software validation to look for. And that also gets portrayed, people from the inspectors and the auditors come from industry often, or vice versa. And so you have this industry standard that this is how it's always been done, and this is how it must be done, because this is how people feel comfortable, this is what they've been trained in, this is how they've learned to close those gaps and those risks in their validation processes. but it doesn't really fit the need of the current model of software. Software has gotten incredibly mature between 1997 and 2001, and that the amount of testing that we can do on an automated fashion at the code level, that unit integration, contract testing, et cetera, doesn't, that formal validation from the front end and from the user end doesn't really fit the need of our country, of our industry, of our companies. And particularly as we move into a SaaS world on the cloud. So when you have a premise version of a software, you have a lot more control of exactly when you're getting enhancement features and updates. You can plan accordingly, and what it actually ends up leading to is release sitting, and so that you wait until there's 3 or 4 major upgrades of a software before you decide to undertake this insurmountable amount of software validation that is needed to be able to validate this massive upgrade of your premise version. Now the very few companies even offer premise versions of their software. Everything's on the cloud. Everything is a software as a service, SaaS cloud model, where you're going to be getting regular updates when you have to have a much more agile approach to validating your software and accepting these new features. And one of the issues with industry standards is that, I expect particularly in a regulatory industry, is that it's very slow to change. So the example I was joking about with colleagues is, hey, bloodletting used to be the industry standard for healthcare. And so we have to be able to evolve what the industry standard is. We have, obviously we no longer use leeches to balance the humors for people. And so it's not nearly the same, the industry standard is just what everyone's been doing because everyone's been doing that for as long as they can. And particularly with CSV, there's really not that critical thinking that is being talked about and embedded into lots of the risk models, lots of the new ISO standards, around being able to have real critical thought about how you're using the software. So what is the business purpose and the use case for your specific company, for your specific industry, to drive that validation? You're not just having this blanket approach to the validation software. So like I was saying, when we had premise version softwares, when that was the norm, you could take 6 months to validate. It wasn't necessarily the best use of your company's time and energies and resources, but you could potentially have that option to you. But traditional CSV takes a very long time. We've had customers who have talked about their processes taking 2 years to accept a major upgrade of some software within their company. Because it's such a burden to do this full validation process for each major release, it's a real roadblock for going to the cloud, is that you keep putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, which just makes it bigger and bigger and bigger to be able to validate all of those changes between your current release and the new release that you plan on upgrading to, because it's so difficult to go through that traditional computer software validation process. And then obviously there is a lot of documentation that comes from software validation. There's the full validation package and all of the different test scenarios and the rationale for the test scenarios and the reviews of the test scenarios and any deviations or defects and resolutions of those defects, et cetera. There's lots and lots of paperwork of all of these very comprehensive validation tests that don't necessarily add value to your intended usage. There's that Incredibles quote, is that if everyone's a super, then no one is. If everything is critical, if everything is given the same level of criticality and your attention for your validation testing, then none of it's critical. Because you're not actually able to really focus your energy and your resources on validating software. And as we know as quality professionals, the quality departments are not always getting the highest or biggest piece of the pie when it comes to the budget. So being very smart and strategic with how you allocate your resources for validation is very important to maintaining a quality suite and a validated state for your products, especially as you're moving to the cloud and getting those new features faster and working with the vendors for your SaaS solutions. So what are the first steps? What is the first move towards going from a very traditional CSV model to even a true risk-based validation approach? What we have seen is that the FDA has actually been saying, don't do the full CSV suite. They've been saying that since 2002 in their final guidance and talking about computer software validation. They strategically and frequently repeated the phrases, validate your intended use. Look at how you're actually using the software, not what you might be using, not all the possible bells and whistles that are available to you, but what are your real critical usage paths? What are you using the software to do? What are your goals with using the software? Validate those. Concentrate your resources and energies on those specific areas. And particularly looking at areas that have an impact on your product quality, patient safety, and your quality system, making sure that you are focusing on the workflows that make your day-to-day life actually function, as opposed to making sure that the help file loads appropriately, which, helpful, good to know that you have a help file, doesn't need to be validated as an electronic record, doesn't need to be validated as part of your electronic signature reviews. Which would be more of the key functionality that you want to spend your resources looking at as part of the validation. And so one of the things that we have really focused on, especially at MasterControl, is getting to a true risk-based validation. And people have been saying risk-based validation again since 2002. This is not a new concept. What MasterControl has done and what we've been encouraging our customers to do is really ground that risk-based validation approach in a process, documenting the critical thinking that you're doing about the functionality that you're using. One of the real problems with functional validation, the OQ validations that's provided by a lot of vendors, is that testing is done in isolation. That it's great that if I click save, it saves, and if I hit cancel, it cancels. That's a fantastic thing to know that it does. Except that if it doesn't do that, when I have these roles and these users and I'm trying to do this after I do this part versus I do this part versus I do this, and I turn this on and turn that one off, that's my usage. That's my actual configuration and intended use of the software. And so it's not helpful to me to know that it works when none of those things are turned on. What I care about very deeply is my intended use of the software. And then another key part of that is looking at your usage risk. So the example that I like to use when I talk about this is that in our software we have a functionality called Explorer Export. And essentially I can take a file folder structure of files. It could be my DHF, it could be my TMF, it could be my whole QMS suite of procedures and forms and controlled records, et cetera, et cetera. And I can export a zipped copy of that to my desktop or to a share drive or to whatever location I prefer. You know, company A might use that to package up their TMF. They might be taking those records for regulatory submission, where they're taking these copies of electronic records and submitting them as part of their trial files. Company B might use that as a secondary, tertiary disaster recovery on a regular cadence. We're taking a snapshot of what our QMS looks like, even on top of doing a full backup of our system as part of our backup and restore procedures, and just having this copy somewhere. I use it to send documents to coworkers. So from a vendor perspective, it's the same functionality. You're not modifying that record. You're not making changes to that record. You're just making a copy of it and putting it somewhere else for people to see. But your intended use of that component is so important to look at for your specific risk levels. So if I'm intending to use that functionality for regulatory and submission, I'm going to mark that component as much higher than if I'm sending that document to my coworkers. Because submitting the wrong documents or incorrectly formatted documents or the wrong version to regulatory bodies as part of regulatory submission is a much deeper risk and impact of failure than sending the wrong documents to Jen. And so it's very important that we look very deeply at the intended usage risk of the specific components. How are you configured? How are you using this to meet your business needs? And from there, you can start looking at where the gaps are between your intended usage and the actual risks posed to you and your company on your usage and your configuration. I'll say that at least 17 more times during this presentation, and where that lines up with the vendor documentation. So a lot of vendors provide internal validation documentations. We do full validation packages of the core product, and we provide it to customers to be able to leverage on their own. And so what you can do is that when you're doing true risk evaluation of your specific configuration and your intended use, you can look at how the vendor actually validated that and find those gaps and use that as your risk-based validation, where based on a documented critical thinking algorithm, we use a calculation for our tool, to determine where can I leverage the internal vendor documentation and where do we think that there's a gap in this configuration, in this validation testing, where I can do my own, where I feel like I need to close that gap with my own formal validation testing. And I want to make this very clear. There's a very distinctive difference between ad hoc guided exploratory user acceptance testing and configuration verification and formal validation testing. Everybody should be doing configuration verification all the time. You want to make sure that your right users are in the right roles, that you have the right workflows set up, that you have the right people doing the investigation steps of the CAPAs for this type of product, for example. Everyone should be looking at that configuration verification, but you don't necessarily need formal validation scripts with pass, fail, and test instructions, expected results, pass, fail, dispositioning, information, objective evidence of every single one of those steps. You don't need necessarily that level of formal validation testing. You should verify it, absolutely, but you don't need to validate it through the formal validation protocols. And the really key part of this risk-based validation is documenting how you're assessing that risk, determining what variables do you care about for determining the risks to your intended usage. So some of the ways that we recommend and that we include is, what is the regulatory sensitivity of my intended use? For the regulations that apply to me and my company, what are the regulatory concerns that we have? So if I'm using Explorer Export, for example, to package my TMF for regulatory submission, that is an exceedingly high regulatory risk. If I'm using it to send documents to my coworkers, not so much. And you can really look at and focus on, is this part of my intended usage? Is this a nice bell and whistle that the software has that isn't really critical to my functionality, isn't really critical to my intended use? Or is this something that is a deeply integrated part of my critical business processes? And so, is this the approval workflow for all of my records? Or is this a formatting of the email template and where I can put my own personal logo for my company for the email template? And really being able to provide that critical thinking and documenting that critical thinking about the risk as part of your validation process and embedding that into your validation package. So one of the great things about using a true risk-based validation approach and really having a foundation for that risk process and that risk documentation in your validation package and your critical thinking and your approach is it saves you a lot of time. It cuts away some of the nonsense. We're no longer treating receiving a training task with the same criticality as a pacemaker working. And so it allows you to really focus on the critical areas that are key and important part of your intended use. So with MasterControl, we have a patented tool, our validation excellence tool. We have found that we can have a new customer fully validated and up and running on our instance of software within 20 hours of work, of starting the validation process. Now, obviously, that's spread out across the process. You create your validation plan, there's an installation process, you get the IQ protocols back, there's a whole configuration process of actually setting up your system in the way that it's supposed to work, that you intend it to, going through this risk-based process and looking at your real configuration compared to say MasterControl best practices. We have a configuration specification of here's how we recommend you use our software. And the closer you stay to the way that your vendor recommends that you use the software, the more likely it is that those validation and usage scenarios have been already covered, that we expect our customers to use our software in this way. We've looked at this role right configuration, having this enabled, this disabled, these 7 people in the role. And then we expect it to work this way and being able to validate that. And so going through that process and ultimately to getting to the final validation report across the whole configuration process, about 20 hours of validation time, which is very exciting for us and as well for our customers, because now you are not focusing your time on validating the software on a vendor software. You are focusing your time on making the products that your company makes. Is that, if you are making pacemakers, it's much more important that you look at the CAPAs and information and validating the actual pacemaker than validating the configuration of the quality system that supports it. And one of the great things as part of being a SaaS software is that because you know exactly which version you are on and which versions you're upgrading to as part of the cloud products, we know exactly what changed in the software, and we can give you very minute details of here's all the functionality that impacts your intended use. Of the ways that you use the software, here's the 10 features that might have an impact on your validated state for your configuration. Let's look at them. Let's determine what impact to the configuration you want to have for this new feature. What needs to change to take advantage of it? Or if you don't want to take advantage of it and don't include it as part of your critical business processes, That obviously lowers your risk for being able to validate. And so we can go through this change control process and reviewing all the changes made to your code base and the potential risk to your intended use in as quickly as 45 minutes. As I've done demos of our VXT, the Validation Excellence tool for MasterControl, I've actually had existing customers in the audience doing their change control upgrade while I'm giving the demo on how to use the tool, which was a very neat and surreal experience. And what we have found is tremendous success with this validation approach. So the most common question I get asked here is this risk-based validation process regulatory compliant? Going through and determining this intended use and documenting that risk process. This is very different for a lot of people from a very traditional CSV process. And VXT and our customers have gone through regular regulatory inspections and audits, and we have never had a single finding. The FDA is a customer of MasterControl's, and they also use this tool for their validation of MasterControl. So we've had tremendous success with this mindset. So being able to document and ground your risk-based validation in being able to document that critical thinking, what variables are you taking into consideration for your intended use of the software, documenting how you're configured versus what the vendor documentation says, and being able to show what those gaps are and determining here's what I think is important for my intended use versus not, can really cut down the amount of time that you're spending validating software that enables you to do your actual jobs. And so this gets into shifting the validation responsibility. A lot of the what we're seeing as a trend in industry is having the vendors owning the majority of the validation documentation. I'm going to put an asterisk on this. Obviously, customers have to prove and maintain and document their validated state. Of course, you have to show how you're being Part 11 compliant with your regulatory procedures and your use of the software. And of course, it is very important to look at those key areas. However, you don't have the same level of knowledge of the configuration and usage of the software. You don't have the key functionality information that the vendors is going to have. You don't have the time. The vendor's full-time job is creating the software. Your full-time job is making pacemakers, for example. And so it's really shifting that responsibility over to the vendors and making the vendors prove and provide that validation documentation for you to leverage. And we have seen again and again from FDA guidances and documents of encouraging to leverage all of the vendor documentation that you reasonably can. And so you really just don't want to focus on the functional validation because you don't generally have control over that when it's a vendor provided software. It's focusing on really your specific configuration and the validation of your configuration and specifically your critical business processes in that process. And so you're, again, shifting that responsibility over to the vendors who you are doing your due diligence audits for to make sure that they have the appropriate documentation and controls in place with their own quality systems to create to create the software that you're leveraging as part of your company and industry approach. So generally, this is done by your vendor. They create this documentation, and what makes it really fantastic is that when it's the vendor's documentation, it's always readily available for regulators. You're not necessarily having to dig through your own archive files and looking for someone's desk for where did this FRS go. Is that because it's created by your vendors, you have easy access to it. And it makes that meeting that requirement of having readily available records for the validation process much simpler when you're in the middle of a regulatory inspection. So like, for example, at MasterControl, we host all of our records on our customer website. So if you're a customer, you can just log in and immediately open and download all the records available to you at any given time. And they're done and redone on every single release. So you have access to that information on a regular cadence, which a lot of vendors do. That is a very common thing to have your vendor providing this kind of validation software, validation documentation for the software that they provide, which makes it much easier for it to be reviewed by regulators and for you to be able to say, this is where this was tested, this is why we chose not to, say, validate that we could open up the help file because this is where it's validated fully from the vendor. And also we had this critical thinking process, this risk-based validation, where we decided that the risk of not opening the help file was very low compared to, say, the risk of ensuring that e-cigs can't be excised and looking at those use scenarios directly. So one of the great things that we're talking about is going through not just risk-based validation, but moving towards a self-validating software. And this is where we're getting into future state, cutting edge items where a lot of companies are doing automated testing anyway. Of course you have to. If you're going to be upgrading, doing this on a regular process, we're not doing manual testing anymore. You have all these automated tools available to you as you're going through this process. And so you're able to use and reuse these automated tools and for each release and push them out. What the next step and what the next phase of the validation here is embedding that automated testing and that automated functionality directly into the core product. And so as I'm configuring, say, my workflow for approving a document, as I'm configuring my CAPA workflow and how I want my investigation steps and verification checks to be done, is that on the back end, this automated tests are creating your own custom validation tests for your specific configuration. So it's no longer a gap assessment like we did for VXT and that risk-based thinking. It's all designed to be embedded into the core product itself and creating that self-validating software. So by taking that automated testing, building it into the core product, and having it run on the back end, after I'm done creating my CAPA workflow, that here's all the forms and the information and the records that I care very deeply about capturing for my CAPA. This is the workflow that it's going to go through. Here are the users that are supposed to be going onto it. I can click a button that says validate, and my custom automated validation tests will run in the background against my configuration, against my users, against my role rights, and provide the custom validation testing for my specific intended usage of this piece of software, instead of having to go back and leveraging. Because while risk-based validation is fantastic and functional and needed for really focusing where your validation efforts need to be, it's at its heart a gap assessment. It's finding the gaps between what's been validated by your vendor and what you need to validate for your very specific usage. And if the focus is going to be on your intended usage, if the focus is on your product quality, your patient safety, your very specific configuration and usage, it's all the more better to look at your specific workflow and the full configuration and being able to validate those intended usage flows immediately as part of the process. So by embedding that automated testing directly into the product, you don't do any manual validation. You click a button and it says validate. At the end, when it's all done, the execution, you get your completed validation report that goes through the inclusion and exclusion criteria, inclusion exclusion criteria for the scope of the validation, for here's all the tests that were run, here's objective evidence for the items that we determined that we needed objective evidence for. If there is deviations or defects, these were the defects that we encountered and where the test had to halt. And it builds it directly into the cloud product. One of the great things about being on the cloud is that we can see what's going on in your environment. And so when you run into a defect in your validation, if it's going to be a software defect, it can be launched directly to your vendor, and they can have a defect created and almost have it resolved before you even pick up the phone to call support. And so by having that true communication that we can see the failures of the validation directly as part of your usage, we can have that very much shorter cycle time of getting issues resolved. And it also means that as the cloud becomes more mature, as SaaS products become more mature, and we're rolling out new features on a regular basis, there's the CI/CD, the continuous integration, continuous deployment mindset for a lot of SaaS companies. You can build that validation directly into that deployment structure, and that you can click a button at a whim and revalidate your intended usage, maintain the validated state as soon as it's ready. So there's no additional resources needed beyond the review and approval of those validation records to go through that validation process. And there's no manual configuration of the automated testing, which is also a process. So even if you do have automated testing, it's separate from your tool. You need to spend the time going through the page taggings and making sure that we're able to see all the information, interact with the information from the front of the UI, and actually run through the validation tests on your own. By having it embedded directly into the software as a core part of the software, you're able to immediately have them updated every time that you make a change to your configuration. If I said, oh, I don't think that this user is appropriate on this step, they'd be better over here on the final approval. And you can make that change and revalidate in an instant to know that this is the change that's been made and have that evidence available to you immediately.